Good morning. It is the beginning of a brand new week. We are in the middle of this incredible course entitled The Storied World of the Bible, looking at the big picture of the story of God, and so it will continue. The pattern has been quite simple, really. We are going to have a short reading, followed by a short lecture or presentation around the topic. Fascinating. And then we will just end it there without me babbling on at the end. So we're going to dive into the next session, but just before we get there, let's start by saying the Jesus Creed out loud together. Hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commands greater than these. Right, here we go, session 5.
This very day the Lord your God is commanding you to observe these statutes and ordinances, so observe them diligently with all your heart and with all your soul. Today you have obtained the Lord's agreement to be your God, and for you to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, and his ordinances, and to obey him. Today the Lord has obtained your agreement to be his treasured people, as he promised you, and to keep his commandments. For him to set you high above all nations that he has made, in praise and in fame and in honor, and for you to be a people holy to the Lord your God, as he promised. The line that starts with Genesis 1, 2 and 3 runs, as we've seen, through to Genesis 12 and onwards, runs through to the book of Exodus, actually runs through in all sorts of ways to Leviticus and Numbers as well, but in particular it runs right through to the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And these first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are known collectively as the Pentateuch, the 5 books, which stand there at the head of the Hebrew canon of Scripture and form the foundation then, in their turn, for everything else that is to come. One of the fascinating things that not everyone realizes about Deuteronomy is that for somebody in the first century, the end of Deuteronomy would have been seen not just as the backstory of Israel, but as actually a prophecy of the whole story of Israel. Because Deuteronomy, from chapter 27 onwards, is setting out the terms of the covenant. The story is that by this stage, the people of Israel have wandered in the desert for 40 years. They have got up, as we look at the map, to the right-hand side of the Promised Land, just across the River Jordan from where Jericho is, where they're about to cross over. And there they are within sight of the Promised Land. And Moses says, now, these are the terms of the covenant. If you're going into the land, this is how it's going to work out. And so he tells this great story of what's going to happen. If they do well, they will live in the land and be fruitful, and if they commit idolatry and fail in their vocation to be God's people, then they will be kicked out of the land, exactly as Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And already we can see the linkage between the beginning of Genesis and the end of Deuteronomy. Then Moses tells this great poem, sings this great song in Deuteronomy 32, which is a poem, a song about all that is going to happen in the future. And one of the greatest writers of the first century, the Jewish historian Josephus, when he talks about Deuteronomy 32, he says Moses gave this song as a prophecy of things that were to take place and, says Josephus, things that are taking place now in our own day. So clearly Jews of the first century, of the time of Jesus and Paul, were able to read the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, not just as saying, well, that's what happened way back then, but this is the roadmap, this is how it's going to work out. So this helps us to understand who we are and what has gone on, what is going on, and what maybe we're supposed to be doing about it now. Because that story of the covenant, Deuteronomy 27, 28, 29 and then 30, is an extraordinary expansion of the original command to the first human pair, the image bearers. They were, we remember, to be in the garden, to be fruitful and multiply, to look after the garden on God's behalf, to reflect the worship of creation back to God, to reflect God's image, God's love, God's stewardship into the world. So we see that now there is this narrative line from Genesis 1, 2, and 3, where Adam and Eve are called to be the image bearers, summing up the praises of creation before God, being the vehicles, the vessels, the agents of God's stewardship in the world, through the call of Abraham, in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed, through the vocation of Israel to be the priestly kingdom, the holy nation in Exodus 19, through the building of the tabernacle in Exodus 40, when the glory of the Lord fills the tent so that Moses can't stand before the divine glory, anticipating what then happens later under Solomon. All of this now comes forward, and we get the same vocation presented again in Deuteronomy 27, 28, 29, and 30. And it's presented in the form of a covenantal narrative, which goes forward, implying that to begin with, things are going to go well, Israel will be fruitful, Israel will be very successful, and things will happen very well for them. But then if they refuse and rebel, and with the if comes the note, and actually this is what's going to happen, then ultimately the curses of the covenant will come upon them. They won't fall out of the covenant. There were times, I think, when Israel might have wished that they could fall out of the covenant. But no, the blessings of the covenant come when they worship God and obey. The curses come when they commit idolatry, when they do on a large scale what Adam and Eve did in the garden, because then they will be sent off into exile. But then Deuteronomy 30 tells a different story, that having gone into exile when all these things have happened to you, then, says Deuteronomy, if you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, if you then return to the Lord your God, and you and your children obey him with all your heart and all your soul, then the Lord will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, and gathering you from the ends of the earth. And then the Lord, says Moses, will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants. In other words, he will ratify the covenant with you like he ratified the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17. Only he will do it in such a way that it isn't just an outward thing. It's something which will be happening deep down inside you. The ancient Hebrews had one way of putting this. Some of the early Christians had other ways of putting it, talking about the heart and the mind and the soul. But the point is to love and serve God from the very depths of your personality, of your humanness, so that you will be genuine humans. You will be genuine Adam and Eve people at last, true image bearers. That's how the Pentateuch works. That the promise to Adam and Eve of the family and the land turns now into a promise, just as God said to Abraham, your family will have their land, but they'll have to be rescued from slavery. So the end of Deuteronomy says, you, Israel, will finally be God's people, but it will be through exile and restoration, through that further time of slavery, and through a new exodus, which will therefore be a doubly new creation. And that's when Moses says that at that time you will find that the law itself will be easy to keep. It won't be a hard, difficult commandment, so that you will say, who will go up to heaven for us and get it for us so that we may hear it and observe it? And it won't be beyond the seas, so that you will say, oh, this commandment, somebody's got to go and fetch it and bring it because it's so difficult. No, says Moses, the word will be near you. It'll be in your mouth and in your heart for you to observe. Fascinating that that is precisely the passage that Paul picks up in the middle of Romans 10, when he too is telling the great narrative, the narrative of creation and covenant, now fulfilled in Jesus. We'll return to that later. The result of all this is that in the second half of Deuteronomy 30, we have something very similar again to the promise and the warning of the Garden of Eden. Moses says, I've set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments and worship God and walk in his ways and love him, then it'll all go well. You will live and become numerous. But if your heart turns away and you don't hear, This is Deuteronomy 30, verse 17. But are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them. There we have it again, idolatry. Worshipping the wrong gods is the root of all evil. Then Moses says, I declare to you today that you will perish. You will not live long in the land. Verse 19, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today. This is the most solemn thing that Moses can say. Creation itself will bear witness, because creation itself was God's good creation, and it still, as it were, knows in its bones how things ought to be. And so from Deuteronomy 30, we are looking right back to Genesis 1, saying this is how the story is supposed to be. And if you're not living the way the story is supposed to be, then the foundational elements of that story, heaven and earth themselves, will cry out and bear witness that you're going the wrong way. And so Moses says, choose life so that you may live, you and your descendants, loving the Lord your God. That's the true worship over against idolatry. Obeying him, that is the obedience that follows from worship, holding fast to him, because that means life, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So do you see how there in Deuteronomy 27 to 30, all the story of the Pentateuch is summed up and refocused, and now it's brought to bear on the land. You are being given this land because you are people of new creation, which is the Exodus. You are the people who are the royal priesthood, the new humanity. You are the people who have the living presence of God in your midst in the tabernacle, so that the priests are the ones who are, as it were, standing dangerously at the intersection of heaven and earth, offering the sacrifices which mean that God's presence can somehow be maintained, even though the people are corrupt and still fraudulent and deceitful and potentially idolatrous. Now this purpose goes forward, and in Deuteronomy 32, with that great song of Moses, it isn't a celebration of here we are on the brink of the promised land and everything's going to be wonderful, isn't it? It's a song of great warning, a rather dark way to finish the book, because after that the book finishes quite quickly with the final blessings on Israel and then Moses' death. The Pentateuch does not end with a shout of triumph. It ends with this sense of two narratives again, going side by side, rather like the sibling rivalries throughout the book of Genesis. That there is the narrative that Israel is the bearer of the promise, but there is also the narrative that Israel is still the carrier of the problem. And that takes us forward into the books, which are very dark and strange books to us, of Joshua and Judges, books full of very strange and scary material about the slaughter of the Canaanites and of other nations that are getting in the way of the children of Israel inhabiting the promised land. There are many puzzles about that, and the book of Judges particularly contains many passages which I suspect most Christians have never been read unless they've read through the Bible the whole way for themselves, because they're very unpleasant and dangerous and nasty. And at the end of the book of Judges we're told why. Because, says Judges, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. There's a sense built into Joshua and Judges that all is not well, that the double narrative of Israel is showing its double nature in a lot of the darkness that's happening, that seems to be, this is what we have to do. But then the writer of Judges particularly is recoiling and saying, things ought not to be like that. And so the books of Joshua and Judges are pointing onwards to something new which is going to happen. Because up to this point, we've got Aaron and his sons as the priests, as the ones who stand between heaven and earth. But if it's a priestly kingdom, there are to be kings as well. And so the next phase of the story, to which the Old Testament builds up rather slowly, is the appointment of kings. Like priests, like Aaron himself, the kings are deeply ambiguous characters. They too instantiate the double nature of Israel's story. But just to round that off, the double nature of the story in Joshua and Judges, I think, only is finally resolved in the New Testament when Jesus of Nazareth, the ultimate King of Israel, bears in himself the horror and the shame and the darkness, which goes far deeper even than the darkness of some of the passages in Joshua and Judges. That's the only way I can understand how this story actually works, that when God himself called a human family through whom he was going to accomplish his purposes, knowing that this human family were themselves part of the problem, then ultimately this constituted a commitment on God's part to work through this double story in person. And the Gospels are the story of how that two-sided narrative finally reaches its horrific and yet salvific conclusion.